The checkpoint officer had told Raya not to cross the zone. She had nodded, thanked him, walked 2 blocks east and climbed the fence anyway. That was 3 hours ago. Now she was belly down on a concrete drainage shelf above the old river course, watching a Kellrath tendril form the size of a city bus drift 30 meters overhead, its underside lit by something that pulsed slow and gold like a heartbeat. It was the 3rd one she had seen since entering the exclusion zone, and it was by far the largest. She had stopped breathing when it appeared over the ridge line. She had not started again yet. "Don't move," said a voice from the drainage pipe to her left. She moved 6 inches sideways, hand reaching for the pocket where she kept the emergency emitter, and found the pipe's mouth occupied by a young man who looked as out of place in the zone as she did. Mid-20s at most, dust on his jacket, hair matted from what looked like a sprint through the scrub fields below. He had a battered survey scanner held up like a shield, and an expression that suggested he was also calculating survival odds. "I'm safe," he said quietly. "Don't use that emitter. The signal will pull them." "Pull what?" Raya whispered back, because the tendril form above them had paused. It was not descending. It had simply stopped moving, its golden pulse slowing, and its underside, the part she'd thought was a ventral surface, had opened slightly, like a slow exhalation, releasing a shimmer of filaments that drifted down through the air and dissolved before they reached the ground. "That," Save said. They both stayed still. The tendril form resumed its drift, moving northeast, the golden pulse returning to its earlier rhythm. Within 90 seconds it had cleared the ridge and disappeared from view. Raya let out the breath she had been holding. "Survey team?" she asked, looking at his scanner. "Was," he said. "The transit at Haveth North closed before my team could get back through. I've been in here for 4 days. He looked at her with the focused wariness of someone who had been making threat assessments for 96 hours straight. "You." "My brother is at the Haveth North assembly point," Raya said. "My transport out of the city was rerouted. I need to get to him before the last evac window." She had already calculated it. 18 kilometers to the transit, 11 hours until the window closed, terrain she had memorized from public maps that had been accurate before the Kellrath arrived, and the landscape had started to change. "I know a route," Save said. She looked at him. He looked tired, but he was still upright and his scanner was still on, which meant he had been navigating successfully and not blundering into tendril forms for 4 days. That was evidence enough. "Show me," she said. Save's route followed the old agricultural drainage network. Channels cut in the 1900s to manage crop irrigation, now overgrown and half-collapsed, but running in the right direction. The channel walls gave them cover, kept them below the sightlines of the tendril forms drifting overhead, and put solid concrete between them and whatever the Kellrath were doing to the soil of the zone's interior. Because the Kellrath were doing something to the soil. Raya had read the council briefings the same way she had absorbed everything that had been public knowledge since the Kellrath insertion craft descended 2 months ago. Methodically, with the specific attention to detail that came from understanding these briefings were not academic exercises. The Kellrath were a biological archive faction. They had seeded Earth's biosphere 6,000 years ago with what the archive translation teams called custodial organisms, living repositories of genetic data embedded into the planetary ecosystem and designed to be collected at a specified recovery interval. They had returned for the collection. The exclusion zone was a quarantine around their primary work sites, established by the Planetary Defense Council, not because the Kellrath were attacking anything. They were not, but because their collection methodology involved atmospheric filtration processes and soil amendment compounds that were incompatible with human respiratory physiology in the short term. The Kellrath were not here to harm anyone. They were here to harvest their own ancient work. It did not make crossing their territory any less dangerous. The tendril forms were collection vehicles, not warriors, but they were enormous, and they moved without any apparent regard for what was beneath them. Raya had watched one drift over a stand of old-growth trees, and the trees had simply stopped, not fallen, not burned, simply ceased to move, their leaves stilling in a wind that was still clearly blowing everywhere else. And she had decided very firmly that she did not want to be under one of those things when it descended to work. 4 kilometers, Save said, checking his scanner. Then the channel ends and we'll have open ground for about 800 meters before we hit the transit side scrub. The open ground is the problem. How did you make it in? She asked. I ran, he said simply, but there were fewer of them then. They've been increasing their density over the site for the past 2 days. He hesitated. I've been watching them. Not just the big ones. The small ones, Raya said. You've seen them too. She nodded. The small ones were different from the tendril forms, each about the size of a large dog, moving in loose groupings along the ground, their surfaces covered in what looked like dense fur, but was almost certainly something else entirely, something that caught light at strange angles and refracted it into momentary prismatic bursts. She had seen a grouping of them moving through a stand of old wheat stubble, and had almost mistaken them for some kind of bioluminescent weather phenomenon. They moved with a deliberateness that was clearly purposeful and with a gentleness that was jarring, each one pausing every few meters to touch the ground, hold still for several seconds, then move on. The briefings don't say what they're doing, she said. No, Save agreed. The briefings describe the collection methodology at a system level. They don't describe what it looks like from inside. What it looked like from inside was unlike anything Raya had a category for. They moved through the drainage channels for 2 more hours, pausing twice when the golden pulse of a tendril form crossed directly overhead. The second time, one of the small ground-level forms passed within 15 meters of the channel wall, and Raya pressed herself flat and watched through a gap in the crumbled concrete. The creature moved through the overgrown verge of the drainage bank without disturbing a single stem. Its prismatic surface shifted colors as it passed, not randomly, she realized, but in a sequence, cycling through what might have been specific frequencies or might have been something she had no word for. At the spot it paused above, a plant she didn't recognize had pushed up through the old channel surface, something with broad, deep-veined leaves that were a blue-gray color, entirely unlike anything in the local flora. The creature held still above it for a long time, long enough that Raya's legs cramped and she shifted carefully, and it still did not move. Then it made a sound, not loud, barely audible, but structured. A series of tonal pulses, not the random clicks of an animal but something organized, repeating with slight variations, clearly a language of some kind. And the plant, the strange blue-gray plant, vibrated in response. Raya's throat went tight. The creature moved on. She found Save looking at her from 3 meters away, and she realized her eyes had gone wet at the edges. She blinked it away. It was talking to it, she said very quietly. I think so, he said. They moved on. The open ground section arrived sooner than expected. The drainage channel ended at a collapsed junction where the walls had been folded inward by something large passing over them, and beyond the collapse was the 800 meters of former agricultural flats that Save had warned her about. The transit-side scrub was clearly visible on the far edge, dense cover, and beyond it, the distant linear shape of the Haveth North barrier structures. 1,100 meters, maybe. Raya recalculated her brother, the evac window, the distance. The flat was not empty. 3 tendril forms moved slowly across the midsection of the flat, their paths crisscrossing in wide arcs, each one lit gold and amber in the late afternoon light that was beginning to angle through the zone's particulate-heavy air. The small ground forms were everywhere, dozens of them, moving in the pattern she was beginning to recognize as purposeful, each one finding its specific plant, its specific point of contact, its specific moment of still speech. The flat looked, from the drainage channel's edge, like something between a harvest and a ceremony. "We can go around," Save said. "There's a longer route through the north field. It adds 4 kilometers and maybe 2 hours." Raya did the math. She had less than 2 hours before the window. "We can't go around." He looked at the flat. She looked at the flat. The tendril forms were drifting, not stationary. Their paths were arcing, not hovering. If they could move between the arcs, stay low, avoid the ground form's attention. "Follow my pace," she said. "Don't stop moving unless I stop. Don't run." "You've done this before." "No," she said, "but I know how not to be seen." She had grown up in the infrastructure of a city that had been built with the understanding that at some point, something would come back for what it had left behind. She had spent her childhood learning the hidden corridors, the underground routes, the access panels behind meter housings. She knew how to move through spaces that were not meant for her. She stepped out onto the flat. The tendril forms continued their arcs. The small ground forms continued their slow, purposeful paths. Raya moved between them, angling around the clusters, reading the patterns of the ground forms' movements the way she had learned to read patrol schedules in the city's defense briefings, not by memorizing fixed positions, but by understanding the logic of the motion. They always paused in the same way. They always turned toward specific vectors. They were predictable because they were purposeful, and she could work with purposeful. Save was close behind her. She heard his breathing, controlled, not panicked, and was grateful for it. Halfway across the flat, one of the tendril forms altered course. It did not move fast. It arced toward a new position, its path bringing it on a track that would carry it over the line she and Save were walking. She stopped. Save stopped. The tendril form's golden pulse slowed the way she had seen the first one slow, that exhalation quality deceleration that meant it was about to work. She did not run. It passed 40 meters above them, its underside open in that same slow exhale, the filaments drifting down. One filament, a single gossamer strand, descended long enough to almost reach the ground before dissolving. It passed within 3 meters of Raya's outstretched hand. She had put her hand out without deciding to. She did not know why. The tendril form's pulse resumed its traveling rhythm. It moved on. She kept walking. They reached the transit-side scrub. She pushed into the dense cover, heard Save crash through the brush behind her, and kept moving until the scrub gave way to the cleared approach to the barrier structures. And there was the checkpoint, a real one, with actual officers and a working gate, and beyond it, the transit assembly area. She spotted Tam from 50 meters away. He was standing at the edge of the assembly area with a blanket around his shoulders and an expression of concentrated worry that dissolved the second he saw her. He ran. She ran. The collision was undignified and complete, and she did not let go for a long time. When she finally looked up, Save was standing a few meters away, giving her space, his scanner dangling from his hand. He looked at the transit area with the expression of someone who had been moving toward something for 4 days and had finally arrived and did not know what to do with stillness. "You have family here?" she asked. "No," he said. "My team. I need to find my team." But he did not move immediately, and she understood the zone was still behind them both, and neither of them had fully stepped out of it yet. "The plant," she said. "The blue-gray one, do you think it knew?" He considered the question as seriously as it deserved. "I think it responded," he said. "Whether it knew, I don't know what that means for something like that." She thought about the filament, about the hand she had extended without deciding to. "They're not going to be done for a while," she said. "The collection, the briefing said weeks." "Months," he said, "maybe longer." "Then there's more of it," she said, "more of what we saw." He looked at her steadily. "You want to go back?" "No," she said immediately. Then, "Not now, not without," she stopped. She had been going to say not without understanding what she had been looking at. She realized that was exactly what she meant, not without knowing more. Save looked at his scanner, then at the zone scrub line, then at her. He had the expression of someone recalibrating a calculation they had been running on the wrong assumptions. "The survey team's instruments are still in the zone," he said. "At the site we were working when the transit closed, we left them. Could you find them again?" "Yes." She looked at Tam's safe, wrapped in a blanket, already talking to a transit coordinator who was handing him something warm. "Safe. After my brother is processed and settled," she said. Save nodded. Something in his face had eased in a way that had nothing to do with having crossed the zone, and everything to do with having found a direction again. They walked toward the checkpoint together. Behind them, in the golden particulate air of the exclusion zone, the tendril forms continued their slow, patient arcs across the ancient work of a civilization that had come home to finish what it started 6,000 years ago. The small forms moved through the blue-gray plants they had tended across a span of time that made the fence and the checkpoint and the evac window feel very small and very new. Not every homecoming was a threat. Not every return was a war. Some things came back only to finish what they had always meant to tend.